Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we will journey back into the mists of 15th century England, stepping softly into an era of grand castles, shadowy corridors, and a bitter, multi-generational feud known to us as the Wars of the Roses. We are going to explore a deeply complex, beautifully tragic, and intensely fascinating period of British history, a time when the crown of England was violently tossed between two rival branches of the same royal family tree, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. I want you to make yourself entirely comfortable. Pull your blankets up a little higher. Let your shoulders drop and allow the tension to melt away from your muscles as we travel across the cold, dark waters of the English Channel and arrive on the misty shores of medieval Britain. Imagine the scent of damp earth, the crisp, chilling breeze rolling over rolling green hills, and the distant, rhythmic tolling of a heavy iron church bell echoing through a quiet stone village. I find it truly fascinating how the seeds of a massive, bloody civil war are usually sown not on the muddy battlefields, but in the quiet, lavish chambers of palaces generations before the first sword is even drawn. When we think of the Wars of the Roses, we immediately picture the iconic symbols, the deep, velvet red rose of Lancaster and the pure, pale white rose of York. But to truly understand the sheer weight of this conflict, to understand why cousins turned upon cousins, and why the English soil drank so much noble blood, we must go back in time, long before these fragrant blooms were ever plucked to serve as badges of war. We must return to the 14th century, to the reign of King Edward III. King Edward was a towering figure of the medieval world, a warrior king whose reign was marked by military glory and a remarkably stable court. He lived a long time, and perhaps more importantly, he was deeply blessed, or perhaps cursed, by an abundance of healthy, ambitious sons. It is a strange irony of royalty that having no heirs brings absolute ruin, but having too many capable, royal-blooded sons can lay the foundation for a spectacular disaster decades down the line. Edward had 5 sons who survived into adulthood, and from these 5 men, the great royal houses of England would fracture and splinter. Let us visualize the Great Hall at Westminster. During the twilight of Edward's reign, the massive room is illuminated by hundreds of flickering beeswax candles set in heavy iron chandeliers, casting long, dancing shadows against the woven tapestries that line the cold stone walls. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke from the massive hearths, mingling with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the heavy perfumes of the attending lords and ladies. Sitting near the aging king are his sons, strong, proud men dressed in rich, heavy fabrics, deep crimson velvets, midnight blue silks, and cloaks lined with soft white ermine fur. The eldest was Edward, famously known to history as the Black Prince. He was the heir apparent, a fierce and legendary military commander who seemed destined to be one of England's greatest kings. But fate, as it so often does in history, had a different design. The Black Prince contracted a lingering illness, likely dysentery, during his campaigns in Spain, and he died before his father, leaving behind a young son named Richard. When old King Edward III finally passed away, The heavy, jeweled crown did not pass to another strong, seasoned warrior. Instead, it was placed upon the small, fragile head of a 10-year-old boy, King Richard II. I often reflect on the immense, crushing psychological weight placed upon a child in that era. Imagine being 10 years old, swathed in robes of state that are too heavy for your small frame, sitting upon a massive wooden throne, while grown men, hardened battle commanders, and ambitious uncles kneel before you, swearing fealty. Richard grew up entirely surrounded by the suffocating atmosphere of court politics. He developed an exalted, almost absolute view of his own divine right to rule, demanding absolute subservience and growing intensely paranoid of the powerful nobles around him, especially his uncles and their incredibly wealthy descendants. The most powerful of these uncles was John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt was perhaps the wealthiest man in England, holding vast estates, immense castles, and commanding a personal retinue of knights that rivaled the king's own army. When John of Gaunt died, King Richard made a fatal miscalculation, driven by fear and a desire to consolidate his own absolute power. Richard seized the massive Lancastrian inheritance and banished Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, exiling him from the shores of England for life. It strikes me that history pivots on exactly these moments of profound overreach. Henry Bolingbroke was not a man to accept exile and disinheritance quietly. While Richard was away campaigning in the damp, treacherous bogs of Ireland, Henry returned to England. He landed on the Yorkshire coast, initially claiming he only wanted his rightful inheritance back. But as he marched south, the great lords of England, tired of Richard's erratic, tyrannical, and deeply unpopular rule, flocked to Henry's banner. The quiet march of a disinherited duke quickly swelled into a massive, unstoppable revolution. King Richard II was captured, imprisoned within the cold, isolated walls of Pontefract Castle, and ultimately forced to abdicate. Close your eyes and picture the solemn, deeply tense atmosphere inside the Tower of London or the halls of Parliament as a reigning, anointed king is stripped of his divine right. It was an unprecedented, earth-shattering moment. Henry Bolingbroke stepped forward, claiming the throne through right of conquest and his descent from Edward III, crowning himself King Henry IV, the first monarch of the House of Lancaster. Richard would mysteriously die in captivity shortly after, likely starved to death in the cold, lightless depths of a stone dungeon. By taking the crown by force, Henry IV had permanently broken the sacred, unbroken line of succession. He had proven that the English crown could be taken by the man with the strongest army, a dangerous, deeply unsettling precedent that would haunt his descendants. Henry IV's reign was plagued by rebellions, guilt, and the constant, exhausting effort of holding onto a stolen crown. He wore himself out, dying a physically broken man, and passing the throne to his son, the legendary Henry V. Now Henry V is a figure of pure, unadulterated medieval romance. He was the warrior king personified, a man of intense religious devotion, strategic brilliance, and unyielding charisma. He sought to unite his fractured country by directing their martial energies outward, launching a massive invasion of France. We all know the famous story of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Picture the deep, suffocating mud of the French fields, the driving, freezing rain, soaking through wool and rusting the chainmail of the exhausted English army. They were starving, sick, and heavily outnumbered by the glittering, magnificent armored cavalry of the French nobility. Yet, through superior tactics, the lethal efficiency of the English longbowmen, and Henry's sheer force of will, they achieved a miraculous, devastating victory. The sky darkened with thousands of arrows whistling through the cold autumn air, striking down the French knights as they struggled helplessly in the deep, churning mud. Henry V became a legend, a hero who conquered Normandy, and was officially recognized as the heir to the French throne. He married the French princess, Catherine of Valois, and it seemed as though the House of Lancaster had achieved absolute, unshakable, supreme glory. But then, tragedy struck with breathtaking suddenness in the prime of his life. At the height of his extraordinary power, Henry V contracted dysentery while besieging a French town. He died at the age of 35, leaving behind his young widow and an infant son who was barely 9 months old. This brings us to the true beginning of our tragic tale, the reign of King Henry VI. If I could pinpoint the exact moment the Wars of the Roses became inevitable, it would be the moment the heavy crown of England and the disputed crown of France fell onto the tiny, unknowing shoulders of a baby lying in a wooden cradle. A country ruled by a child is a country ruled by ambitious men in the shadows. Let us quietly observe the royal nursery. The room is warm, heated by a crackling fire in a great stone hearth. Soft woven rugs cover the draughty floorboards. Nurses in linen wimples move silently about, rocking the intricately carved wooden cradle. Inside sleeps a tiny, fragile boy, oblivious to the fact that he is technically the King of England and France. Standing around this cradle, however, are the grand lords of the realm, men with hard faces, clad in heavy velvet doublets and gold chains of office. They are the royal uncles, the bishops, and the powerful magnates who will form the Regency Council. As long as the king was a child, these men could cooperate, bound by a shared duty to protect the realm. But as Henry VI grew, it became tragically apparent that he possessed absolutely none of his legendary father's martial prowess, charisma, or strength of will. Henry VI was a deeply pious, incredibly gentle, and completely ineffective man. He detested the sight of blood. He dressed in simple, modest clothing, rather than the rich silks of a king, and he suffered from profound bouts of mental instability, moments where he would completely withdraw from the world, sitting motionless and unresponsive for months at a time, nature abhorring a vacuum. The absolute power of the English throne began to slip from Henry's weak grasp, falling into the hands of a small, deeply unpopular clique of nobles who manipulated the quiet king for their own vast personal gain. The beautiful, hard-won conquests in France, the legacy of Agincourt, began to crumble and burn, territory by territory, falling back into French hands as the English leadership bickering and schemed in the dark, smoky halls of Westminster. And watching all of this decay, watching the humiliation of England, and the disastrous mismanagement of the realm, was the wealthiest and most powerful man in the country. A man who possessed a royal bloodline, even more direct, in some ways, than the king himself. This man was Richard, the Duke of York. The stage is now set. The clouds are gathering over the green hills of England. The wind is growing colder, and the fragile peace of a divided royal family is about to completely shatter. Richard, the Duke of York, was a man who seemed to have been carved from the very stone of the ancient, formidable castles he inhabited. He was fiercely proud, enormously wealthy, and deeply aware of his own royal bloodline. While King Henry VI descended from the third son of Edward III, Richard of York could trace his lineage back to both the second and the fourth sons. In the incredibly complex, mathematically precise world of medieval inheritance, York possessed a claim to the throne that many whispered was actually superior to the king's own. Try to imagine the sheer, suffocating tension this created within the drafty, echoing corridors of the royal palaces. Everywhere the king looked, there stood York, a man who looked like a king, acted like a king, and commanded the respect that a king should command, yet was forced to kneel before a monarch who was visibly crumbling under the weight of the crown. I often think about what it must have been like to walk through the royal court during those tense, quiet years. You would hear the soft rustle of heavy silk and velvet, the muffled clinking of gold chains, and the low, hushed whispers of nobles gathering in dark corners. The air would be thick with the scent of burning beeswax, roasting meats, and the sharp, metallic tang of suppressed ambition. In this tense, shadowy world, another deeply fascinating figure emerged, a woman who would become the fierce, unyielding heart of the Lancastrian cause. Her name was Margaret of Anjou, the French bride of King Henry VI. When I reflect on Queen Margaret, I am struck by the intense, historical misunderstandings that often surround her. She arrived in England as a remarkably young woman, stepping off a wooden ship into a cold, damp, and foreign land. She was beautiful, highly educated, and possessed a spine of absolute steel. She quickly realized that her husband, the gentle, pious king, was completely incapable of managing the ruthless wolves of the English nobility. Where Henry retreated into his prayers and his quiet contemplation, Margaret stepped forward into the harsh, blinding light of political warfare. She wore her ambition like a suit of armor, determined to protect her husband's crown, and, eventually, the inheritance of her own son. Close your eyes and visualize Queen Margaret sitting in her private chambers. The room is draped in incredibly rich, colorful French tapestries, an attempt to bring some warmth to the biting English chill. She is dressed in a gown of deep, dark green velvet, her dark hair bound in an intricate, jeweled headdress. Her eyes are sharp, calculating, and fiercely protective. Beside her stands her closest ally, Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. Somerset was a Lancastrian cousin, a charming, elegant man who held immense influence over the king and queen, much to the absolute boiling fury of the Duke of York. The rivalry between the Duke of York and the Duke of Somerset was the spark that would eventually ignite the entire country. York viewed Somerset as a disastrous military commander, blaming him for the humiliating loss of English territories in France. More intimately, York felt that Somerset was intentionally poisoning the king and queen's minds against him, isolating York from the inner circle of power that his royal blood demanded. It is a tragic reality of human nature that the bitterest wars are often not fought over grand ideals, but over perceived slights, personal hatreds, and the desperate, grasping desire for proximity to power. The political temperature continued to rise, a slow, agonizing boil. York, feeling continuously sidelined and physically threatened, began to gather his vast personal armies. Imagine the deep, resonant thud of heavy wooden boots on packed dirt roads, the clatter of steel armor and the snapping of brightly colored banners in the cold wind as York's retainers marched from his grand northern estates down towards London. He did not claim to want the throne, at least not yet. He claimed only that he wanted to remove the corrupt, evil councillors from the king's side, specifically aiming his sword at the throat of the Duke of Somerset. Then, in August of 1453, the fragile, trembling structure of the English government completely collapsed. King Henry VI, who had always been a fragile, delicate man, suffered a profound, catastrophic mental breakdown. Without any warning, he slipped into a deep, unresponsive catatonia. He could not speak. He could not walk. He could not even lift his head. When his beloved wife, Queen Margaret, brought their newly born, desperately awaited son, Prince Edward, to the king, Henry simply stared at the infant with blank, uncomprehending eyes. He did not recognize his son. He did not recognize his wife. He did not know he was the King of England. Visualize that heartbreaking, terrifying moment. In the darkened bedchamber, the heavy velvet curtains are drawn tight against the light. The king sits, slumped, in a beautifully carved wooden chair, entirely lost in a dark, silent world inside his own mind. Queen Margaret, her face pale with shock and terror, clutches her swaddled infant to her chest, realizing that she is suddenly, terrifyingly alone in a court filled with incredibly dangerous men. The king was gone, trapped in a waking sleep, leaving the realm entirely rudderless. This tragic illness forced the hands of the nobility. The country could not function without a leader, and with the king incapacitated, the natural, undeniable choice to rule in his stead was his most powerful royal cousin, Richard, Duke of York. York was officially appointed protector of the realm. For York, this was the ultimate vindication, a moment of supreme triumph. He immediately moved to imprison his great rival, Somerset, locking him deep within the cold, heavily guarded walls of the Tower of London. York began to rule England with the efficiency, strength, and authority that Henry VI had always lacked. But as you listen to the rhythmic breathing of your own body, letting yourself drift deeper into relaxation, remember that in the medieval world, power was never truly secure. Just as York began to comfortably settle into the massive, heavy seat of absolute power, fate intervened once again. A year and a half later, King Henry VI miraculously, suddenly woke up. It was as if a heavy, suffocating veil had suddenly been lifted from his mind on a quiet winter morning. Around Christmas of 1454, King Henry VI looked around his royal chamber, his eyes finally focusing, finally seeing the world that had been hidden from him for over a year. He saw his beautiful wife, Queen Margaret, weeping with absolute relief, and when she placed the infant Prince Edward into his arms, the king wept too, declaring that he had known nothing of what had happened, and thanking God for his recovery. I find it profoundly fascinating and deeply tragic how a single man's return to health can actually be the most dangerous thing for an entire kingdom. With the king awake, the entire political landscape of England violently shifted on its axis in a matter of hours. The Duke of York's time as protector of the realm instantly evaporated. Queen Margaret, fiercely protective and intensely aware of the danger York posed to her son's inheritance, moved with lightning speed. She ordered the immediate release of her close ally, the Duke of Somerset, from his cold cell in the Tower of London. Somerset was restored to all his former glory, his velvet robes dusted off, his chains of office placed proudly back around his neck. For Richard, Duke of York, this was not just a political defeat, it was a matter of life and death. He knew exactly how the brutal game of medieval politics was played. He had imprisoned Somerset, he had ruled in the king's stead, and now the king and queen would surely seek their revenge. Listen to the wind howling outside the thick stone walls of the castle. It is the sound of an impending storm. York immediately packed his vast household and fled the royal court, riding hard for the safety of his northern estates. But York did not flee alone. He was joined by a family whose name would become synonymous with the Wars of the Roses, the tremendously wealthy and fiercely ambitious Neville family. Specifically, York allied himself with the Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's brilliant, ruthless young son, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick is a man we must pay very close attention to, for he would soon earn the dramatic title of the Kingmaker. Together, these lords gathered a formidable army of thousands of men, hardened soldiers from the northern borders, and began a slow, deliberate march back south toward London. When Queen Margaret and the Duke of Somerset received word of this advancing northern army, they quickly assembled a royal force, calling upon the king's loyal lords, including the Duke of Buckingham. In May of 1455, King Henry, carrying the royal banner, rode out of London, hoping to intercept York before he could reach the capital. The two great, bristling armies collided in the narrow, winding medieval streets of a small market town called St. Albans. When I reflect on the first Battle of St. Albans, it strikes me how incredibly intimate and terrifying medieval urban warfare must have been. This was not a battle fought on a wide, open, green field. This was a brutal clash fought in the dirt, the mud, and the narrow alleyways of a civilian town. Imagine the absolute terror of the local townsfolk. The heavy wooden shutters of the timber-framed houses were slammed shut and bolted tight. The streets smelled of damp earth, horse manure, and the sharp, metallic scent of thousands of armed men gripping unsheathed swords. The royal forces quickly barricaded the main streets, dragging heavy wooden carts, barrels, and timber across the roads to block York's advance. For hours, tense negotiations took place. York sent messengers, demanding that the king hand over the Duke of Somerset, promising that if Somerset was delivered to him, he would lay down his arms. But the king, or perhaps the lords speaking for him, absolutely refused to yield. The heavy, suffocating silence of the standoff was finally broken by the deafening blast of trumpets and the roaring battle cries of the Yorkist army. The first blood of the Wars of the Roses was about to soak into the English soil. York's forces launched a brutal frontal assault against the barricades, but the royal defenders held firm. The heavy thud of arrows, burying themselves into thick wooden planks, echoed through the town. The narrow streets became a deadly choke point, and York's men were taking heavy casualties. But then, the brilliant tactical mind of the young Earl of Warwick changed the course of history. Instead of throwing more men at the impenetrable barricades, Warwick led his heavily armoured soldiers through the back gardens and narrow alleyways of the town. Close your eyes and hear the sudden, terrifying sound of splintering wood and shattering plaster. Warwick's men literally crashed through the thin, wattle and daub walls of the civilian houses, pouring out into the town square behind the royal defenders' lines. They burst into the streets with terrifying speed, their swords raised, catching the king's men completely by surprise. Dovicidal chaos erupted in the market square of St. Albans. It was a chaotic, bloody melee of screaming men, the ringing clash of steel on steel, and the panicked whinnying of war horses. The Duke of Somerset, York's great rival, realized the battle was lost. He attempted to fight his way out, bursting from the doors of the castle inn. But he was surrounded by Yorkist soldiers. Somerset fought fiercely, but he was quickly overwhelmed and brutally struck down in the muddy street, his blood mixing with the dirty water of the gutters. And what of King Henry VI? The gentle, pious king found himself trapped in the center of a horrific nightmare. During the chaotic fighting in the square, a stray Yorkist arrow whistled through the air and grazed the king's neck, drawing royal blood. Terrified, bleeding, and surrounded by the deafening roar of slaughter, the King of England abandoned his banner and stumbled into the dark, foul-smelling shop of a local tanner, seeking refuge among the drying animal hides. When the fighting finally stopped, the Duke of York found his king hiding in this dark, wretched little shop. The sheer hypocrisy of the medieval code of honor is sometimes astounding. York, the man who had just launched a violent attack on the royal army and killed the king's closest friends, walked into the tanner's shop, dropped to his knees in the blood-soaked dirt, and bowed his head. He swore his absolute, undying loyalty to the trembling, bleeding king, assuring Henry that he only ever meant to protect him from evil counselors. But the words meant nothing. The peace of England had been permanently shattered. The first Battle of St. Albans was relatively small, but its psychological impact was massive. Noble blood had been spilled in open rebellion. Sons of the fallen Lancastrian lords would now grow up, nursing a deep, burning desire for revenge. York escorted the king back to London, essentially as a royal prisoner, and once again took absolute control of the government. The wheel of fortune had turned, but the war was only just beginning. For 4 long, deeply uneasy years following the bloodshed at St. Albans, an incredibly fragile and suffocatingly tense peace settled over the realm. Richard, Duke of York, had secured his position as protector of the realm once again, effectively ruling England, while the gentle, recovering King Henry VI nodded quietly in agreement to whatever heavy parchment documents were placed before him. But if you were to walk the shadowy, echoing corridors of the royal palaces, during this time you would feel a heavy, undeniable dread hanging in the air, thick as the morning fog off the River Thames. Queen Margaret of Anjou had absolutely not forgotten the humiliation of St. Albans, and she certainly had not forgiven the men who spilled the blood of her closest allies in those muddy streets. Imagine the Queen retreating from the Yorkist-dominated city of London, moving her court and her household to the sprawling, heavily fortified castles of the English Midlands. Here, surrounded by fiercely loyal Lancastrian lords, she began to quietly, methodically build an army of her own. She essentially replaced the king's authority with her own, handing out intricately crafted silver badges shaped like a swan to her favored knights and archers, creating a vast, private royal military force dedicated solely to the protection of her young son, Prince Edward. I find it entirely fascinating how power in medieval England could so easily shift geographically. London may have held the official seat of government, the ancient stone walls of Westminster and the Tower, but true, raw power resided simply wherever the largest, best-equipped army was gathering. To mask these deep, terrifying preparations for war, a truly bizarre and highly theatrical event was orchestrated by the king. In the spring of 1458, it is known to history as the Loveday. Picture a grand, sweeping procession through the winding, cobblestone streets of London, leading to the magnificent, towering wooden spire of the old St. Paul's Cathedral. In a desperate, deeply theatrical attempt to prove to the common people that the kingdom was finally at peace, the bitterest of enemies were forced to walk hand in hand. Close your eyes and visualize Queen Margaret, dressed in shimmering, unbelievably heavy cloth of gold, her face set in a forced, unnatural smile, being escorted hand in hand by none other than her greatest enemy, Richard, Duke of York. The young sons of the Lancastrian lords, who were brutally slain at St. Albans, walked side by side with the very Yorkist men who had ordered their fathers' deaths. It was a beautiful, magnificent, and entirely transparent lie. Underneath the heavy velvet robes and rich furs, men wore hidden shirts of steel chainmail, and their polite smiles did not reach their cold, calculating eyes. As soon as the echoing, angelic chants of the cathedral choir faded into the stone vaults, the great lords returned to their heavily fortified castles and immediately resumed sharpening their swords. The fragile, painted facade of the Loveday completely shattered just a year later. In the cold, wet autumn of 1459, the Duke of York, sensing that Queen Margaret's massive Midlands army was finally ready to march against him, sent desperate ravens and riders, calling his allies to his formidable stronghold at Ludlow Castle, located on the rugged, unforgiving Welsh marches. Visualize this sprawling, dark stone fortress, perched high above the winding, rushing waters of the River Tame. The autumn air is biting and cold, the ancient oak trees stripped of their leaves, and the surrounding brown fields are rapidly transformed into a sea of white canvas tents and crackling campfires as the Yorkist forces arrive. The Earl of Salisbury marches in after a bloody, exhausting skirmish at Blore Heath, and the brilliant Earl of Warwick arrives from his powerful post in Calais, bringing with him a highly trained, elite garrison of professional, battle-hardened soldiers. But Queen Margaret and her Lancastrian commanders had learned from their past tactical mistakes. They marched on Ludlow with a massive, overwhelming royal army entirely dwarfing the Yorkist forces. And crucially, this time, they brought the king. This was a devastating, crippling psychological blow to the Yorkist soldiers. It was one thing to fight supposedly evil councillors in the narrow streets of a market town, but it was entirely another to raise armed weapons against a massive sea of men flying the king's own personal, sacred banner with the anointed sovereign physically present on the battlefield. As night fell over the cold, deeply tense encampment at Ludford Bridge, the morale of the Yorkist army completely collapsed. The professional soldiers Warwick had brought from Calais, veteran men who fought for pay and practicality, saw the king's banner flapping heavily in the dark, wet wind. They quietly deserted, slipping away into the freezing black night to join the royal camp, refusing to commit high treason against the crown. When I reflect on this moment, I cannot help but feel the crushing, desperate panic that must have gripped Richard of York in his command tent. In the pitch-black dead of night, realizing that a morning battle would mean absolute, undeniable slaughter and certain execution for treason, the great, proud Yorkist lords made a humiliating, truly desperate decision. They abandoned their sleeping army. They left behind their wives, their young children, their heavy iron artillery, and their camp followers. They mounted their fastest horses and fled into the absolute, terrifying darkness of the Welsh borderlands. York took his second son, Edmund, and rode hard for the wild, rugged western coast, eventually securing secret passage on a merchant vessel to the safety of Ireland, where he was still wildly popular. The Earl of Warwick, the Earl of Salisbury, and York's exceptionally tall, strikingly handsome eldest son, Edward, the Earl of March, fled south. They undertook a terrifying, storm-tossed crossing of the freezing English Channel in a stolen fishing boat, ultimately taking refuge behind the massive, impenetrable stone walls of the city of Calais. As the cold, grey morning sun finally rose over Ludford Bridge, the abandoned, deeply confused Yorkist soldiers woke to find their leaders gone. They surrendered to the royal army without a single sword being drawn. The Lancastrian forces then enthusiastically and brutally sacked the nearby town of Ludlow, drinking the taverns completely dry, stealing everything of value and stripping the magnificent castle bare. Queen Margaret had achieved a bloodless, absolute, and total victory. Her enemies were scattered to the freezing winds, disgraced, utterly broken and officially branded as traitors by a parliament packed with Lancastrian loyalists. The House of Lancaster stood entirely triumphant, their grip on the heavy crown of England seemingly secure once more. But exile, as history so often proves in its darkest chapters, is rarely a true defeat. It is merely a deeply uncomfortable pause, a quiet, dangerous period of waiting in the long shadows. From the cold, rain-slicked stone walls of Calais and the distant emerald shores of Ireland, the Yorkists watched the dark sea, waiting for the wind to change. Their vast ambitions were not extinguished by the freezing waters of the Channel. Rather, they were burning hotter, sharper, and brighter than ever before, while the exiled Yorkist lords stared out at the cold, grey expanse of the sea, nursing their wounded pride and carefully sharpening their swords. Queen Margaret moved with a swift, merciless political efficiency that would ultimately prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. In the bitter, freezing winter of 1459, she summoned a parliament in the heavily Lancastrian-controlled city of Coventry. This assembly would become infamously known to history by a truly chilling name: the Parliament of Devils. I find the Parliament of Devils to be one of the most fascinating and deeply tragic turning points in the entire conflict. When I reflect on it, it strikes me that in politics, just as in war, the absolute worst thing you can do to a powerful enemy is to leave them with absolutely nothing left to lose. Inside the echoing, draughty stone halls of Coventry, surrounded by lords loyal only to the Red Rose, a horrific legal weapon was unleashed upon the absent Duke of York and his allies. It was an act of attainder. To be attained in medieval England was a fate almost worse than death on a battlefield. It meant that a man's blood was legally declared corrupt. Not only were Richard of York, the Earl of Salisbury, and the Earl of Warwick sentenced to death for high treason, but their vast lands, their towering castles, their immense wealth, and their noble titles were entirely stripped away. But the true cruelty, the political overreach that shocked the English nobility to its core was that this punishment extended to their innocent heirs. The sons of York and Neville were completely disinherited, legally erased from the kingdom. Queen Margaret thought she was permanently destroying the Yorkist threat. Instead, she had just guaranteed that they would fight to the absolute bitter end, because the only way to reverse an act of attainder was to overthrow the government that issued it. Let us travel across the freezing, choppy waters of the English Channel to the towering stone walls of Calais, where the Earl of Warwick and young Edward, the Earl of March, were weathering the winter. Close your eyes and imagine the biting, salt-heavy wind whipping off the dark sea, snapping the vibrant banners atop the castle keep. Warwick, brilliant and fiercely charismatic, did not sit idle in his exile. Calais was England's only foothold on the continent, heavily fortified and guarding the narrowest part of the Channel. Recognizing that he had no money to pay his garrison of veteran soldiers, Warwick essentially turned to state-sponsored piracy. He sent his heavily armed ships out into the freezing waters, capturing wealthy foreign merchant vessels, seizing their cargoes of wine, wool, and spices, and bringing the rich spoils back to the cheering men of Calais. It is a strange irony that while the Lancastrian government in London was going completely bankrupt and failing to protect the English coasts, this exiled, a tainted traitor was being celebrated as a patriotic hero by the common sailors and merchants in the taverns of southern England. Warwick was fighting a brilliant psychological war, painting the Yorkists as the true defenders of the realm. By the summer of 1460, the Yorkists were ready to strike back. The heavy winter snows had melted into the lush, vibrant green of an English summer. In late June, Warwick, Salisbury, and the towering 18-year-old Edward of March landed on the warm, sandy beaches of Sandwich in Kent. They brought with them a hardened corps of professional soldiers. But as they began their march toward London, something incredible happened. The common people of Kent, deeply exhausted by Lancastrian corruption and heavy taxation, flocked to the Yorkist banner by the thousands. Imagine that long, dusty march through the warm summer air. The sound of thousands of boots tramping on the dry dirt roads, the creaking of heavy wooden supply carts, and the gleam of summer sunlight striking polished steel helmets. The sheer momentum of the Yorkist advance was terrifying. When they reached the massive stone walls of London, the city gates, which should have been heavily defended, were simply thrown wide open by a sympathetic populace. The Yorkists marched right into the capital, taking control of the city's resources, while Lancastrian loyalists barricaded themselves inside the Tower of London. But Warwick knew that holding the capital meant nothing if the king's army was still in the field. Leaving the aging Earl of Salisbury to lay siege to the tower, Warwick and young Edward of March led their heavily armed forces north, marching through the sweltering July heat to meet King Henry VI. They found the royal army deeply entrenched outside the town of Northampton, positioned with their backs to the rushing, swirling waters of the River Nene. The Lancastrians had chosen a formidable defensive position. They had spent days digging deep, muddy trenches and driving sharpened wooden stakes into the earth. Crucially, they had brought a terrifying modern weapon to the battlefield: heavy iron field artillery, rows of primitive cannons packed with black powder, their dark, heavy muzzles pointed menacingly toward the approaching Yorkist army. As Warwick's men formed their battle lines, staring up at the heavily fortified earthworks, the sky above them began to darken. Heavy, bruised, purple storm clouds rolled in over the English countryside. And then the heavens opened. A torrential, blinding summer downpour began to fall. The rain came down in absolute sheets, turning the dry, baked earth of the battlefield into a slippery, treacherous quagmire of thick, clinging mud. This sudden, violent change in weather was an absolute disaster for the Lancastrian army. When the Yorkist trumpets blared and Warwick's men began their heavy, exhausting charge up the muddy slopes toward the barricades, the Lancastrian gunners desperately brought their burning matches to the touch holes of their heavy cannons. But there was only the damp, useless sizzle of wet powder. The torrential rain had completely ruined their artillery. Not a single cannon fired. Even without the guns, the deep trenches and sharpened stakes should have held the Yorkist advance. The battle was a brutal, chaotic melee in the blinding rain. Men slipped and slid in the deep mud, the heavy, suffocating weight of their wet armor dragging them down as swords clashed and arrows flew wildly through the storm. But medieval battles were so often decided not by bravery or weather, but by the cold, calculated sting of betrayal. Commanding the right wing of the Lancastrian defences was a noble named Lord Grey of Ruthin. Unbeknownst to the king or the Lancastrian commanders, Lord Grey had secretly been exchanging deeply coded messages with the Earl of Warwick. As the Yorkist forces struggled desperately to climb the muddy earthworks directly in front of his position, Lord Grey gave a quiet, terrifying order to his men. Imagine the sheer shock of the Lancastrian soldiers as Lord Grey's men suddenly lowered their heavy pikes, stepped away from the barricades, and reached down into the mud to physically pull the Yorkist soldiers up over the walls, guiding them safely into the royal camp. The Lancastrian defensive line collapsed instantly. Absolute panic ripped through the royal army. Surrounded and betrayed, the Lancastrian commanders, including the powerful Duke of Buckingham, fought desperately outside the king's tent, but they were quickly cut down in the bloody, churning mud. The Battle of Northampton lasted barely 30 minutes. When the screaming and the clash of steel finally died down, replaced only by the steady, drumming sound of the falling rain, the Earl of Warwick walked slowly toward a large, incredibly ornate royal pavilion that stood alone in the center of the ruined camp. Inside, sitting quietly in a beautiful chair, was King Henry VI. He had been left completely alone by his fleeing army, listening to the slaughter of his closest friends in the pouring rain. Once again, a Yorkist lord entered the king's presence, dropped to his knees in his heavy, blood-spattered armor, and swore his absolute, undying loyalty to the trembling monarch. With the gentle, compliant king back in Yorkist custody, the heavy, rain-soaked banners of the defeated Lancastrian army were trampled deep into the Northampton mud. The Earl of Warwick, ever the brilliant political strategist, escorted King Henry VI back south to London. He treated the monarch with the utmost outward respect, bowing deeply, speaking softly, and housing him in the magnificent royal apartments of the Bishop of London's palace. But the grand wooden doors were locked, and heavily armed Yorkist guards stood in every shadowed corridor. The king was, once again, a beautifully dressed prisoner, entirely at the mercy of the men who had just slaughtered his commanders. For the young, towering Earl of March and the charismatic Earl of Warwick holding the king meant they held the machinery of the English government. They immediately sent rapid, desperately awaited word across the Irish Sea, calling for Richard, Duke of York, to finally return from his cold, damp exile. Imagine the crisp, chilling autumn winds of September 1460. Blowing across the dark, swelling waters of the Irish Sea as a fleet of wooden ships carried the Duke of York back to the shores of England. He landed near Chester, but something profound had shifted within the Duke during those long, bitter months of banishment. When I reflect on this moment, I am struck by how long suppressed ambition, when finally released, can completely blind a man to the political realities around him. Before his exile, York had always meticulously claimed that he was merely a loyal subject seeking to remove evil counsellors from the king's presence. But as he marched south toward London this time, the heavy woolen banners snapping above his advancing army were not the familiar colours of the House of York. Instead, his standard-bearers proudly carried the undifferenced royal arms of England, the majestic gold lions and delicate French lilies, a symbol that could only be legally flown by the anointed, reigning monarch. Richard of York was no longer coming to protect the king. He was coming to replace him. The Duke's procession into London was breathtakingly arrogant and heavily theatrical. He rode into the city with a vast retinue, a naked sword carried upright before him, a terrifying symbol of absolute sovereign authority. He rode directly to the Palace of Westminster, where the lords of the realm, including his own close allies, were gathered in Parliament. Try to visualize the immense, cavernous space of Westminster Hall. The soaring oak hammer beam roof disappears into the dark shadows above. The hall is packed with the great nobility of England, wearing heavy, dark robes lined with fur against the autumn chill. The air is thick with the smell of burning beeswax and damp wool. York strode into the great hall with heavy, confident steps, his armour clinking softly. He walked straight past the gathered lords, past the high-ranking bishops, and marched directly up the stone steps to the heavy, elaborately carved, empty wooden throne. The entire hall fell into a stunned, absolute, and suffocating silence. York stood before the empty throne, and slowly, deliberately placed his armoured hand upon the royal cushion. He stood there, looking out over the sea of faces, fully expecting the great lords to immediately drop to their knees and cheer for their new king. But no cheers came. Not a single voice cried out in support. Even the Earl of Warwick, York's most vital and powerful ally, stared at the Duke with a mixture of profound shock and deep anger. It is a remarkably tense, intensely human moment. York had grossly miscalculated. To the medieval mind, deposing a living, anointed king, even a weak and mentally fragile one, was a terrifying breach of the natural divine order. The lords were absolutely unwilling to cross that terrifying threshold. The silence stretched on, heavy, awkward, and deeply humiliating for the proud Duke, until the Archbishop of Canterbury finally stepped forward and asked York, in a tight, strained voice, if he wished to go and see the king. York, his face flushed with sudden anger and embarrassment, sharply replied that there was no man in England who did not owe him homage, and he stormed out of the hall. A deeply uncomfortable, agonizing political stalemate followed. For 3 incredibly tense weeks, the great lords argued behind thick wooden doors, while the autumn rain lashed against the stone windows of Westminster. Eventually, a truly desperate compromise was hammered out. A fragile, brittle document, known as the Act of Accord. Under the flickering, warm light of hundreds of candles, King Henry VI, completely isolated and surrounded by his enemies, was forced to sign away his own son's birthright. The Act of Accord declared that Henry would remain King of England for the rest of his natural life. However, upon his death, the crown would not pass to his young son, Prince Edward. Instead, Richard, Duke of York, was officially named the Prince of Wales, the Lord Protector and the absolute, undeniable heir to the English throne. The House of Lancaster had been legally disinherited with a single stroke of a feathered quill, but legal documents, no matter how heavily stamped with red wax, mean absolutely nothing to a mother desperately fighting for her child's survival. If the Yorkist lords truly believed that Queen Margaret of Anjou would simply accept the disinheritance of her beloved son and quietly retire to a nunnery, they were living in a dangerous, fantastical dream. Queen Margaret was far away from the political suffocations of London. She was moving rapidly through the wild, rugged landscapes of Wales and northern England, gathering the furious remnants of the Lancastrian cause. She called upon the powerful northern lords, the fierce Percy family, the Cliffords, and the remaining loyalists who had lost fathers and brothers to the Yorkist swords. Her army was growing at a terrifying rate, swelling into a massive, hungry force of tough northern soldiers completely dedicated to the fierce French queen and the disinherited young prince. When reports of this massive, gathering storm in the north reached London, the Duke of York realized he could not simply wait for the winter snows to pass, leaving the Earl of Warwick in London to guard the captive king, York, along with the Earl of Salisbury and his second son. Edmund, the Earl of Rutland, rode out from the capital in the freezing, bitter cold of early December. They marched their forces north, pushing through the icy, biting winds and frozen mud, intending to crush Queen Margaret's rebellion before it could march on the capital. They were heading directly toward the Duke's formidable northern stronghold, Sandal Castle, completely unaware that they were marching straight into a beautifully orchestrated, devastating Lancastrian trap. As the heavy oak gates of Sandal Castle finally closed behind the exhausted Yorkist army just days before Christmas in 1460, a false, freezing sense of security settled over the Duke of York. Sandal Castle was a formidable, towering fortress, its massive stone walls rising high above the sprawling, frost-covered plains of Yorkshire. Inside, the fires were lit, casting long, dancing shadows against the cold, damp stone, but the warmth was an illusion. The Duke of York, the man who had legally claimed the very throne of England just weeks earlier, was now entirely trapped. Queen Margaret's vast northern army, commanded by the vengeful Duke of Somerset and the ruthless Lord Clifford, had swiftly moved in, effectively cutting off all supply lines to the castle. I often sit and wonder about the profound, heavy silence of that particular Christmas. Imagine the biting, bitter cold of the medieval winter. The skies above Yorkshire were a bruised, heavy grey, threatening snow. Inside the castle walls, provisions were desperately low. There was no grand feasting, no joyful singing. Only the quiet, anxious murmurs of freezing soldiers, rationing out stale bread and salted meat, while they stared out of the narrow arrow loops at the surrounding dark woods. The Lancastrian army, numbering perhaps 3 times the size of York's forces, was out there in the freezing mist, waiting patiently like a massive pack of wolves circling a wounded stag. Then came the 30th of December. It is a date that is written in thick, dark blood in the annals of English history, for reasons that historians have fiercely debated for centuries. Richard, Duke of York, made a fatal, inexplicable decision. Instead of remaining behind the impenetrable, thick stone walls of Sandal Castle and waiting for his brilliant ally, the Earl of Warwick, to arrive from London with reinforcements, York ordered the castle gates thrown open. He commanded his heavily armoured forces to march down from the high ground out into the open, freezing expanse of Wakefield Green to face the Lancastrian army. When I reflect on this moment, it absolutely defies military logic. Was he desperately low on food, forcing a foraging party out into the open? Was he deceived by Lancastrian troops, carrying false banners, tricking him into believing reinforcements had arrived? Or was it simply the blinding, arrogant pride of a man who believed his royal blood made him invincible? Whatever the reason, as the Yorkist army marched down into the snow-dusted valley, the trap snapped shut with terrifying mechanical precision. The Lancastrian forces had secretly split their massive army. As York engaged the main body of troops to his front, thousands of hidden Lancastrian soldiers suddenly emerged from the dark, winter-stripped woods to his left and right, executing a perfect, devastating pincer movement. Imagine the sheer, absolute terror of that moment. The sudden, deafening blast of enemy trumpets echoing through the freezing air, the horrifying realization that you are completely surrounded. The snow on the ground quickly turned into a churning, slippery nightmare of thick mud and dark red blood. The Battle of Wakefield was not a tactical masterpiece. It was an absolute, chaotic slaughter. Richard, Duke of York, the man who had reached out and touched the empty throne of England, fought desperately in the centre of the swirling melee, but he was pulled down in the brutal, freezing mud and killed, his life ending not in a warm royal bedchamber, but under the heavy, slashing steel of vengeful northern lords. But the tragedy of Wakefield did not end with the Duke's death. As the Yorkist army completely collapsed and men threw down their weapons to flee, York's second son, Edmund, the 17-year-old Earl of Rutland, tried to escape. Picture this young, terrified boy, accompanied only by his tutor, desperately scrambling through the freezing, chaotic streets of the town, making a frantic run for the stone arches of Wakefield Bridge. He was trying to vanish into the winter mist, but he was spotted. Lord Clifford, a fierce, terrifying northern lord, whose own father had been brutally killed by the Yorkists 5 years earlier at St. Albans, rode down the young Earl. On the cold, wet stones of the bridge, the terrified boy fell to his knees, weeping, begging for his life. In the brutal, unforgiving code of blood feuds, there was no mercy. Lord Clifford simply looked down at the boy and reportedly said, "By God's blood, thy father slew mine, and so will I do thee." The young Earl was struck down without hesitation. The following day, the Earl of Salisbury, the aging patriarch of the powerful Neville family, who had also been captured in the bloody snow, was dragged into the Lancastrian camp and summarily executed. Queen Margaret's forces had achieved a complete, utterly devastating victory. The leadership of the House of York had been entirely decapitated in a single freezing afternoon. To ensure that the entire kingdom knew of this absolute Lancastrian triumph, the victorious lords engaged in a display of deeply macabre, chilling medieval mockery. They took the severed head of Richard, Duke of York. They placed a fragile, mocking crown made of simple paper and straw upon his cold, lifeless brow. They then carried this grisly trophy to the massive stone gates of the city of York, spiking it high upon the battlements, perfectly positioned, so that the dead duke's blank eyes stared out over the lands he once ruled. A cruel, echoing phrase was whispered among the Lancastrian soldiers: "Let York overlook the town of York." It seemed, to any rational observer, shivering in the dark winter of early 1461, that the Wars of the Roses were finally, definitively over. The Duke was dead. His son was dead. His greatest northern ally was dead. Queen Margaret's massive, terrifying army was entirely unopposed in the north, free to march south to London, to rescue the captive King Henry and reclaim the heavy crown. But the brutal, violently spinning wheel of fortune had not stopped turning. Far away, on the rugged, mountainous border of Wales, a fast-riding messenger on an exhausted, foam-flecked horse arrived at the gates of Gloucester. He carried the devastating, horrific news of the slaughter at Wakefield to Richard's eldest son. Edward, the Earl of March, was barely 18 years old. In a single, shattering moment, he lost his father and his beloved younger brother, but he also instantly inherited a massive, fiercely loyal army, the immense wealth of his family, and, most dangerously of all, the legal right to claim the English throne. The terrified boy who had once fled in a fishing boat was gone. Edward was now the new Duke of York, a towering, incredibly handsome warrior who possessed a brilliant, aggressive military mind, and he was absolutely burning with a cold, unquenchable desire for total revenge. The crushing, icy weight of grief and the sudden, terrifying burden of leadership did not break the young Edward, Duke of York. Instead, it forged him instantly into something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. He was barely 18 years old, standing on the wild, rugged Welsh marches when he received the horrifying news that his father and brother had been brutally butchered in the northern snow. A lesser soul might have collapsed into inconsolable weeping, or perhaps fled across the sea to safety. But Edward possessed a towering, powerful physique, standing well over 6 feet tall, and a military mind that was naturally aggressive, intuitive, and completely, utterly ruthless. Picture this young warrior, his handsome face set in an expression of cold, stony resolve, standing outside his tent on a frozen, misty February morning in 1461. He was surrounded by his fierce, fiercely loyal border knights. He knew that to his east, a large Lancastrian army, composed primarily of Welsh soldiers commanded by the Earl of Pembroke, was rapidly marching to trap him. Edward did not wait to be surrounded. He immediately marched his forces to intercept them, meeting them at a place called Mortimer's Cross. I find it truly remarkable how history blends the brutal realities of war with moments of profound, breathtaking superstition. As the freezing morning mist began to lift from the Welsh landscape, the terrified soldiers in Edward's army looked up into the heavens and gasped in absolute horror. High in the cold sky above them, there appeared a stunning, rare astronomical phenomenon, likely caused by ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. Instead of one single, pale sun, 3 distinct, glowing suns were visible in the sky, arranged in a perfect, glowing triangle. To the medieval mind, this was not science. It was a devastating, terrifying supernatural omen of divine wrath. A collective, fearful groan rippled through the Yorkist ranks, men dropping to their knees, certain that God had abandoned their cause. But Edward of March saw not a threat, but a brilliant, unparalleled opportunity. He did not possess his gentle father's hesitation. Edward spurred his warhorse forward, positioning himself directly in front of his trembling men, the 3 suns gleaming brightly behind his armored shoulders. He reportedly shouted that this was not a bad omen, but a sign of glorious victory. The 3 suns represented the Holy Trinity, and more specifically, they symbolized the 3 surviving sons of the House of York, united by God to crush their enemies. His booming voice and unshakable confidence completely transformed his army. The fear evaporated, replaced by a fierce, fanatical religious fervor. They charged into the Lancastrian lines with a ferocious, unstoppable fury, completely utterly routing the Welsh army. The 3 sons of Mortimer's cross became Edward's personal badge, a symbol that he had conquered both nature and men through sheer, unyielding force of will. But while the young star of York was rising in the west, a terrifying, massive black cloud was rapidly descending from the north. Queen Margaret's enormous northern host was marching south towards London, and they were fueled by a ferocious hunger and an insatiable desire for absolute vengeance. Visualize this vast, sprawling Lancastrian army moving like a devastating, hungry plague along the ancient, worn surface of the Great North Road. These were tough, rugged soldiers from the Scottish borders and the wild northern dales. To encourage them to join her massive army, Queen Margaret had reportedly granted them a truly horrifying license: the right to plunder and pillage any settlement they conquered south of the River Trent. Close your eyes and hear the distant, terrifying sound of panicked, tolling church bells echoing across the freezing landscape. You smell the acrid wood smoke from burning villages, the air thick with the dust of thousands of tramping boots, and the terrifying, echoing cries of a terrified population fleeing before the advancing storm. The town of Luton was sacked. Dunstable was put to the sword. St. Albans, once again, prepared itself for absolute disaster. The Earl of Warwick, the brilliant political kingmaker now holding London, realized he had to stop this terrifying northern avalanche before it could reach the capital. He marched the royal army, carrying the captive, mentally fragile King Henry VI, along with him like a lucky charm, to intercept the Queen's forces near the old, familiar battlegrounds of St. Albans. The Second Battle of St. Albans, fought in the swirling winter snow of February 1461, was a completely different beast than the first compact urban fight. It was a sprawling, confusing, and terrifying conflict of large armies clashing in a howling blizzard. Warwick, usually so tactically brilliant, made a massive, critical mistake. He spread his forces too thinly across the countryside, relying on primitive artillery and complex defensive lines that the brutal weather and the chaotic, fierce Lancastrian charges completely and utterly nullified. Warwick's lines were completely overrun, his army fragmented in the snowstorm, and for the first time in his legendary career, the Kingmaker was forced to turn his horse and flee the battlefield. But the most devastating, truly critical detail of the battle happened far away from the screaming and the bloodshed. Visualize King Henry VI. The gentle, pious monarch found himself sitting entirely alone under a great, snow-dusted oak tree, listening to the cacophony of the battle raging in the white fog around him. For 5 long years, he had been a royal pawn, moved silently around the board by York and Warwick. Then, a fast-riding Lancastrian knight, splattered with mud and melting snow, spotted the isolated king. He realized who it was, dismounted in a chaotic rush, and dropped to his knees, finally, bringing Henry VI back to the arms of his victorious wife and son. It was a beautiful, deeply touching reunion, a small flicker of human warmth in the absolute, freezing brutality of the war. But the victory at St. Albans was a political mirage for the House of Lancaster. The victorious, ravenous Northern Army, now reunited with their king, was poised just 20 miles from London. But the citizens of London, watching the terrifying glow of burning villages just to their north, were absolutely paralyzed with terror. They locked the massive city gates, chained the heavy wooden shutters on their houses, and barricaded the streets. They would not open their gates to an army they believed would simply sack and burn their ancient city to the ground. Queen Margaret, perhaps realizing the strategic mistake of her army's brutal reputation, hesitated. She did not order an assault on London. Instead, she halted her army and sent messengers, trying to negotiate entry, giving her terrified soldiers time to plunder the surrounding abbey of St. Albans, while they waited in the freezing winter camps. This critical, trembling moment of hesitation changed the entire course of English history. While the Lancastrian army waited, consuming all the food in the surrounding countryside, and, growing increasingly restless, the young, victorious Edward of March was not waiting. After his brilliant victory at Mortimer's Cross, he had marched east with astonishing, almost superhuman speed, uniting his fresh, hardened forces with the retreating, defeated remnants of Warwick's army. I often find it truly mesmerizing how the perfect storm of charisma, momentum, and sheer desperation can completely and utterly shatter centuries of divine, ancient tradition. Edward was not marching to London to humbly ask the citizens for entry. He was not marching as a loyal protector. He was 18, he was invincible, and his bloodline demanded the heavy crown of England that his father had died reaching for. In late February, while the Lancastrian negotiations stalled, Edward and Warwick rode hard and fast into the open city of London. They did not arrive as defeated men. Edward rode with his brilliant new badge, the 3 Sons of York, snapping proudly in the crisp, cold wind. He rode through the crowded, muddy streets, his towering physical presence and striking good looks captivating the terrified London crowds. who saw him not as a traitor, but as their beautiful, powerful, and deeply necessary saviour. The people of London, who had locked their gates to the gentle, rightful King Henry, threw their arms open and cheered with a deafening, fanatical roar for the young usurper who would protect them. The final, bloodiest, and most decisive chapter of the Wars of the Roses was about to be written on the snowy fields of Yorkshire, and the new Duke of York was ready to claim his bloody inheritance. The entry into London was not merely a military occupation. It was a carefully orchestrated political rebirth, a breathtaking display of propaganda and charisma that swept away centuries of established medieval tradition in a single roaring afternoon. While King Henry and Queen Margaret's massive, hungry northern host waited in the freezing winter camps outside the locked city gates, stalled by their own brutal reputation, young Edward of March seized the moment with a predatory instinct that his pious father had completely lacked. On the 4th of March, 1461, London became the stage for an unprecedented political theatre. Visualize the grand, cavernous space of Westminster Hall, illuminated by the soft, diffuse grey light filtering through the high Gothic windows. It was packed, not with the full nobility of the realm, many of whom were away arming for the Lancastrian cause, but with the common people of London, the wealthy merchants, and a few key Yorkist lords. The brilliantly astute Earl of Warwick, the masterful Kingmaker, stood before this crowd and publicly proclaimed Edward's right to rule. In that moment, a fundamental shift occurred in the very definition of English kingship. Warwick didn't just assert bloodline. He argued that Henry VI had forfeited his divine right by breaking the Act of Accord and rejoining his wife's army, effectively making himself a traitor to the very government that protected him. It strikes me how quickly legitimacy can be manufactured when matched with desperate need. The question of right was put directly to the common people in the hall, and the response was a deafening, fanatical shout. King Edward! King Edward! Edward, a towering and incredibly handsome figure, then ascended the steps, not to be formally crowned yet, but to take symbolic possession of the royal throne, the massive crown of England, resting heavy and significant upon the high altar nearby. But acclamations in a warm hall, no matter how loud, do not win wars. Just days later, leaving the elderly Earl of Salisbury to guard the capital, the new King Edward and the Earl of Warwick rode out of London, heading north along the ancient, frozen surface of the Great North Road. This was no longer a dynastic squabble. It was the total, desperate mobilization of a kingdom. Visualize this massive Yorkist army on the move, through the raw, biting cold of an English march. It was a sprawling, chaotic, and heavily armed city on the march. Thousands upon thousands of men tramping through the freezing mud. Supply wagons groaning under the weight of grain, wine, and newly forged iron weapons. Blacksmiths' fires dotted the nightly camps, their heavy hammers ringing out in the deep silence, repairing chainmail, and sharpening the thousands of lethal English longbows that were the true muscle of the realm. The destination was Yorkshire, the heartland of the enemy. While Edward marched north, The Lancastrian commanders, the veteran Duke of Somerset, and the ruthless Lord Clifford, had withdrawn their massive host to the relative safety of the city of York. Behind them, they gathered a truly terrifying force. Historical estimates suggest that by the time both armies were fully assembled, nearly 60,000 men, representing perhaps 1/10 of the entire adult male population of England, were preparing to butcher each other over a single dynastic claim. The physical reality of that number, gathered in one place in the 15th century, is almost impossible to comprehend. The Lancastrians, outnumbering the Yorkists, chose their battlefield with meticulous strategic brilliance. Some 15 miles south of York, near the obscure village of Towton, lies a high, exposed limestone plateau. Close your eyes and visualize this desolate place. To the west, the ground drops away sharply, plunging steeply down into the chaotic, icy torrent of a small river known as the Cock Beck, swollen and raging with spring melt. The only easy access onto the plateau was from the south. The massive Lancastrian army drew up their battle lines across this high ground, their right flank anchored safely against the steep, wooded ravine, their left flank protected by the marshy, treacherous lowlands. The Yorkists, arriving from the south, would be forced to march uphill directly into the faces of a larger, deeply entrenched enemy. For several days, minor skirmishes crackled along the edges of the encampments. It was a brutal wait in the open, freezing winter landscape. Men huddled closely together for warmth, the air thick with the sharp smell of burning wood, wood smoke, and the copper tang of fear. The peaceful, religious rituals of Palm Sunday were about to be shattered by the single largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. In the early, grey hours of Palm Sunday, March 29, 1461, the Yorkist army began their slow, agonizing ascent onto the Towton Plateau. They were led by a brilliant, experienced veteran named Lord Fauconberg, the uncle of the Earl of Warwick. The conditions were absolutely abysmal, a sensory nightmare of medieval warfare. A brutal, freezing wind howled across the exposed high ground, bringing with it a blinding, horizontal blizzard of heavy, driving sleet and sharp, icy snow that stung the eyes and numbed the hands, wrapping the entire battlefield in a terrifying, chaotic white fog. It is a moment frozen in time, the absolute, trembling silence before the storm. Fauconberg looked at the swirling snow and realized that the wind was blowing directly from the south, straight into the faces of the Lancastrian lines. He saw not a curse, but a strategic miracle. He ordered his thousands of longbowmen to step forward into the deeper snow, advance until they were just within maximum range, and unleash a single, massive, coordinates volley of heavy war arrows. The sky darkened as thousands of lethal shafts rose up into the blizzard, the powerful tailwind, catching the feathers and violently driving them far deeper into the Lancastrian ranks than anyone thought possible. Thousands of arrows found their marks in the blinding whiteout, striking down surprised soldiers before the battle had even truly begun. The single, deadly arrow volley of Palm Sunday had commenced the dance of death. This was not a graceful, strategic engagement of high-minded ideals. It was a brutal, industrial slaughter, a visual nightmare of medieval violence, fought under the veil of Palm Sunday. Close your eyes and hear the visceral, suffocating cacophony of that battlefield. The high-pitched, metallic screaming of steel against steel. The sickening, dull thud of heavy lead maces, crushing metal helmets and the living bone beneath. The guttural cries of thousands of men, the frantic prayers of the dying and the panicked whinnying of maddened horses, all muffled and distorted by the relentless, howling blizzard. The air was thick with the foul, coppery tang of fresh blood, and the acrid, swirling smoke of burning pitch torches, struggling to stay lit in the chaos of the storm. For 10 agonizing hours, the lines of battle surged back and forth across the plateau, men fighting with a desperate, animalistic fury. The massive, towering figure of the young King Edward himself at the very forefront, his greatsword swinging in devastating, tireless arcs, his own staggering personal losses fueling a cold, unstoppable martial energy. His presence alone, the 3 suns gleaming faintly on his standard, through the thick, swirling snow, kept the utter exhaustion at bay for his smaller, battered army. I find it deeply affecting to reflect on the sheer, physical exhaustion of these men. Imagine fighting for your very life, clad in perhaps 60 pounds of metal, knee-deep in freezing mud and a blinding blizzard for 10 consecutive hours, without rest or food. If a man tripped over a body, if he simply slipped in the bloody slush, he was not getting back up. He was instantly trampled to death by the heavy wooden boots of his own comrades. The stalemate seemed unshakable. Both massive armies were completely spent, running purely on adrenaline and deep-seated dynastic hatred. The corpses stacking up in terrifying heaps that eventually became part of the bizarre, grisly, defensive terrain. But the final, devastating turn of the wheel of fortune was yet to come. Late in the afternoon, the blinding snow momentarily cleared, and the Lancastrian lines, exhausted but holding firm, looked to their left flank. A collective groan of absolute despair must have risen from their ranks. The Yorkist reserve, thousands of fresh, rested soldiers under the command of the Duke of Norfolk, who had been delayed for hours by the thick mud, finally arrived on the plateau. They slammed into the exposed, weary Lancastrian flank with the force of an avalanche. It was the absolute breaking point. The massive Lancastrian line, which had stood firm since dawn, finally fractured, and then it broke entirely. The retreat was not a strategic withdrawal. It was a blind, chaotic panic. The Lancastrian soldiers threw down their heavy shields and weapons, shedding their armor in a desperate, futile attempt to run faster through the deep, clutching mud. They fled not south toward safety, but west, directly toward the steep, wooded ravine of the Cockbeck. I often think about the sheer, suffocating terror of that retreat. Imagine thousands of panicked, exhausted men plunging into the freezing, swollen, rushing waters of the tiny Cockbeck. Men pushed and shoved each other into the icy current, desperate to cross. But hundreds, perhaps thousands, were dragged down by the weight of their own remaining gear, or the desperate grasps of their drowning comrades, or were simply cut down from behind by the pursuing Yorkist cavalry. So many Lancastrian soldiers were killed in that tiny rivulet that the waters were said to have run with visceral red blood, for days afterward, flowing all the way to the city of York. Crucially, the massive pile of corpses that eventually filled the entire ravine formed a truly horrific, makeshift path. The retreating Lancastrians were forced to run across a devastating bridge of bodies, trampling the cold, dead faces of their own friends and family to escape the relentless Yorkist slaughter. It was the single bloodiest day in English history, a catastrophic loss of life that permanently decimated the old nobility of the realm and secured the newly forged bloody crown upon the head of King Edward IV. The heavy, iron-studded gates of the city of York were quickly thrown open to the victorious, towering young king in the immediate chilling aftermath of Towton. Edward rode through the ancient, narrow streets, not with a roar of triumph, but with a deeply heavy, solemn purpose. I find it incredibly moving, and a profound testament to his character that his very first act as the undisputed monarch of England was not to feast, nor to immediately exact revenge on the trembling townsfolk. Instead, he rode directly to the towering stone battlements of the city gates. There, with quiet, cold efficiency, he ordered his men to gently take down the decaying, weather-beaten heads of his father, Richard of York, and his teenage brother, Edmund. He carefully washed their remains and ensured they were given the solemn, deeply respectful rites they had been so brutally denied. The cruel, mocking paper crown was burned, replaced by the heavy, magnificent reality of true royal power, while the new King Edward IV buried his dead with staggering, lavish royal honours, the remnants of the Lancastrian royal family were thrust into an absolute freezing nightmare. Queen Margaret of Anjou, the gentle, deposed King Henry VI, and the young Prince Edward had not been present at the slaughter of Towton. When they received the devastating, catastrophic news of the army's destruction, they immediately fled north. Imagine their terrifying journey through the dark, biting cold of the early spring. They abandoned their heavy, luxurious velvet robes and their rich baggage trains, riding desperately on exhausted horses into the bleak, desolate wilderness of the Scottish borders. They were transformed overnight from the absolute rulers of the realm into destitute, freezing refugees entirely reliant on the hesitant charity of the Scottish court, watching helplessly as the deep red rose of Lancaster withered in the frost. In London, however, the sun had spectacularly broken through the clouds. In June of 1461, Edward IV was formally crowned in the breathtaking, cavernous grandeur of Westminster Abbey. Try to visualize the sheer sensory overload of a medieval coronation. The air was thick and heavy with the intoxicating scent of burning frankincense and myrrh. Thousands of flickering beeswax candles cast a warm, dancing golden light across the ancient stone pillars, illuminating the magnificent, incredibly intricate stained glass windows. The angelic, echoing chants of the choir filled the massive space, vibrating against the stone. Edward, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, astonishingly handsome and glowing with youth and military glory, was stripped of his heavy plate armor. He was anointed with holy oil and dressed in magnificent robes of shimmering cloth of gold, lined with the purest white ermine. When the heavy, jewel-encrusted crown of St. Edward was finally lowered onto his golden hair, the massive congregation roared their absolute, fanatical approval. England finally had a king who looked, acted, and fought exactly like a king should. For the first few years of his reign, King Edward appeared perfectly content to let the brilliant, highly experienced Earl of Warwick guide the ship of state. Warwick, the legendary Kingmaker, was now at the absolute zenith of his power. He was not just the king's greatest subject. He was practically a co-ruler. He commanded the vast military resources of the kingdom. He personally guarded the treacherous Scottish borders against Lancastrian incursions, and he completely dominated England's foreign policy. Warwick envisioned a grand, sweeping European alliance, and to secure it, he began extensive, highly complex diplomatic negotiations with the King of France. The ultimate prize of these negotiations was to be a magnificent French royal bride for the young, unmarried King Edward. Warwick staked his entire personal reputation and the diplomatic future of England on securing the hand of the French princess Bona of Savoy. But King Edward, despite his brilliant military mind, possessed a fatal, deeply human flaw, an insatiable, overwhelming appetite for beautiful women, and he was fundamentally, stubbornly independent. He was perfectly happy to let Warwick run the government, but he absolutely refused to let the Kingmaker dictate the intimately personal matters of his heart and his bedchamber. It is here that the entire carefully constructed political structure of the Yorkist regime pivots on a remarkably quiet, incredibly romantic, and ultimately catastrophic moment in the spring of 1464. Imagine the deep, ancient, and profoundly quiet woods of Whittlebury Forest in Northamptonshire. The harsh winter has finally broken, giving way to a lush, vibrant, dappled green canopy. The air smells of damp earth, blooming wildflowers, and the sharp scent of pine. King Edward is out hunting, taking a rare moment of leisure, away from the heavy burdens of the crown. He is riding slightly ahead of his loud, boisterous retinue of nobles and hounds. As he rounds a bend in the worn dirt path, beneath the sweeping, massive branches of an ancient oak tree, he encounters a woman waiting for him. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville. I find the story of their meeting to be one of the most utterly fascinating, disruptive romances in all of European history. Elizabeth was not a foreign princess. She was an English commoner. More shockingly, she was a widow, and even worse, she was the widow of a fierce Lancastrian knight who had actually died fighting against Edward's own army at the Second Battle of St. Albans. She was several years older than the king, and she was already the mother of 2 young sons. She had come to the forest that day to throw herself at the king's mercy, desperately seeking to reclaim the confiscated lands of her dead husband so that she could feed her children. But Elizabeth Woodville was also renowned for her extraordinary, almost mesmerizing beauty. She had heavy, pale blonde hair that fell in a shimmering cascade and striking, dragon-like eyes that captivated the young king instantly. Edward, accustomed to taking whatever and whomever he wanted with absolute ease, immediately propositioned her. He offered her wealth, security, and a place as his royal mistress. But Elizabeth possessed a spine of absolute steel. She looked directly into the eyes of the most powerful man in the country, a man who could easily destroy her, and she politely, firmly refused him. She supposedly told him that while she was not good enough to be his queen, she was far too good to be his mistress. If he wanted her, it had to be in lawful, holy matrimony. Edward was entirely unaccustomed to being denied. The thrill of the chase, combined with genuine, overwhelming infatuation, completely blinded him to the devastating political realities of his actions. In a stunning, unprecedented move that completely shattered medieval protocol, Edward agreed. On a quiet, warm morning in May, far away from the prying eyes of the royal court and the calculating gaze of the Earl of Warwick, King Edward IV slipped away from his hunting lodge. Visualize a tiny, humble stone chapel in the quiet Northamptonshire countryside. There are no thousands of cheering lords, no heavy incense, no cloth of gold. There is only the soft morning light filtering through a plain glass window, the quiet murmuring of a single, nervous country priest, Elizabeth Woodville, her mother, and the King of England. In absolute, binding secrecy, Edward married the beautiful Lancastrian widow. It was a beautiful, profoundly romantic, and incredibly human gesture. But in the ruthless, high-stakes game of 15th-century politics, a king marrying for love was an act of supreme, unforgivable selfishness. For 5 agonizingly long, tense months, Edward kept the marriage a total, absolute secret. He smiled, he hunted, and he quietly allowed the Earl of Warwick to continue his intense, public, and highly embarrassing negotiations in France, promising the French king that Edward would soon arrive to marry the princess. Edward had planted a massive, devastating bomb perfectly beneath the foundations of his own throne, and the long, slow fuse was burning rapidly down toward the powder. The devastating, inevitable collision between the king's private heart and the brutal realities of public policy finally occurred in September of 1464. King Edward IV summoned his great council to a meeting in the quiet ancient town of Reading. The massive abbey complex, with its high, echoing stone walls and heavy timber-beamed roofs, became the setting for the most shocking, disruptive, political reveal of the century. Visualize this gathering of the most powerful men in England, wearing their heavy, fur-lined, velvet robes of state. The atmosphere was thick, not with the smell of wood smoke or incense, but with the suffocating, heavy presence of immense state secrets waiting to be broken. I often find myself trying to truly feel the texture of the silence that must have fallen over that great hall. The brilliant, formidable Earl of Warwick, fresh from his intensive diplomatic triumphs in France, stood before the council. With unshakable confidence, he was meticulously outlining the final, complex details of King Edward's impending marriage to the French princess, Bona of Savoy. It was to be the ultimate alliance, cementing Yorkist power in Europe forever. When Warwick finished speaking, he looked to the king, expecting a simple public nod of royal confirmation. But King Edward, standing tall and beautiful against the cold grey stone of the window, did not nod. He took a long, slow breath, and then he shattered the world in a voice that was quiet, but carried with a shocking, absolute authority. Edward informed his stunned council that he could not marry the French princess. Why? Because 5 months ago, in a tiny country chapel, he had lawfully, indissolubly married Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow and an English commoner. In the intense, suffocating vacuum that followed those words, the only sound was the howling of the autumn wind outside the thick stone walls. It is impossible to overstate the absolute catastrophe of this announcement. The Duke of Clarence, Edward's own younger brother, stared at him in horrified disbelief. The great lords gasped, their hands instinctively flying to their heavy gold chains of office. But it was the Earl of Warwick whose face is most etched into this moment of history. When I reflect on Warwick's expression, I see not just political failure, but profound, soul-shattering personal betrayal. The young boy he had made a king, the charismatic general he had championed, had not only destroyed his foreign policy, but had made him an object of public, global ridicule. The Kingmaker had been treated like a political nuisance. The fuse of resentment, which had been burning slowly for 5 long months in absolute secrecy, was finally violently lit. If the English nobility was horrified by the choice of a Lancastrian bride, they were absolutely apoplectic about what came next. Elizabeth Woodville did not arrive at court alone. She brought with her a vast, highly ambitious, and devastatingly numerous family. The new queen had many siblings, including beautiful, highly eligible sisters, and intelligent, power-hungry brothers, like Anthony Woodville, the Lord Scales. King Edward, blinded by infatuation for his new wife, was determined to elevate her family to the very apex of English society. Visualize the magnificent, high-stakes weddings that followed. Elizabeth's beautiful sisters were quickly, brutally married off, not to common gentry, but to the eldest sons and heirs of England's oldest, proudest ducal families, effectively blocking the Earl of Warwick from securing those powerful dynastic marriages for his own 2 daughters. In a particularly grotesque and widely condemned display of power, Elizabeth's dynamic 20-year-old brother, John Woodville, was married to the incredibly wealthy Duchess of Norfolk, a woman who was over 80 years old and already a grandmother. The old nobility, men who trace their lineage back centuries, watched with a silent, simmering disgust as this new faction of upstarts, this Woodville virus, effectively monopolized royal patronage and consolidated immense wealth, all under the protective shadow of the newly crowned queen. The Earl of Warwick, the legendary Kingmaker, who had held the heavy crown of England in his own hands, now felt a cold, terrifying isolation. His advice was ignored. His presence was barely tolerated by the ascending Woodvilles. He did not launch an immediate civil war. That is not how resentment works. Instead, Warwick retreated from the shallow, gossiping royal court. He packed his immense household and rode hard for his sprawling, fortified northern estates. Listen to the repetitive, rhythmic clopping of his horse's hooves on the dry, hard dirt road. It is the sound of a man creating distance, both geographical and emotional. In the quiet, dark stone chambers of his northern fortresses, while the cold winter winds of Yorkshire howled outside, Warwick sat and stared deep into the embers of the hearth. The absolute, unshakable loyalty he once felt for King Edward was being slowly, methodically consumed, burning down and turning into the dark, cold, and heavy ash of profound betrayal. The warm, golden sun of the Yorkist dawn was rapidly, violently fading behind a choking, black cloud of inevitable rebellion. The long, cold shadow of treason did not stretch immediately over the realm. Rather, it began as a single dark thread, woven in the absolute silence of that isolated Yorkshire study. For 3 long years, from 1466 to 1469, the Earl of Warwick, the legendary Kingmaker, walked a terrifyingly fine line between a loyal subject and a mortal enemy. To the outside world, the surface of England remained calm, a polished mirror, reflecting the glory of King Edward IV's court. There were lavish jousts, feasts, where the tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans and spiced wines, and foreign ambassadors continued to bow before the beautiful king and his equally stunning Woodville queen. But under this glittering, expensive surface, the very foundations of the Yorkist regime were actively rotted by resentment and secret ambition. I find it absolutely chilling to reflect on the nature of Warwick's revenge. He did not seek to destroy the House of York. He sought to purify it, to wrest control from the upstart Woodville faction and place the king back under his own absolute guidance. To achieve this, Warwick reached out his powerful, heavily armed hand to a new, dangerously pliable ally. We must now direct our attention toward George, the Duke of Clarence. He was King Edward's younger brother, a young man famously described as witty, elegant, but also intensely ambitious, deeply unstable, and perpetually jealous of his older brother's supreme power. Clarence looked upon the rising power of the Queen's low-born family with a disgust that perfectly mirrored Warwick's own. He felt pushed to the edges of his own family's dynasty. Warwick, the master political manipulator, saw this sibling rivalry and perceived not a family tragedy, but a perfect, lethal weapon. He carefully cultivated Clarence's paranoia, feeding his ego with grand promises of power, position, and wealth, whispering to him that Edward was no longer a king, but merely a puppet of the Woodville virus. Deep breath. Picture a cold, heavily guarded stone chamber inside the impregnable walls of the city of Calais. The date is July 1469. Warwick is still legally the captain of Calais, commanding the only professional, veteran army in the entire realm. He has successfully lured the Duke of Clarence across the freezing English Channel, enticing him away from the watchful eyes of the king's spies. Here, in direct defiance of King Edward's explicit and furious royal commands, the Earl of Warwick orchestrated a staggering act of dynastic rebellion. He married his eldest daughter, the wealthy and pious Isabel Neville, to the Duke of Clarence. I find this secret, renegade marriage inside a fortress on the very edge of the kingdom entirely fascinating. It was a visual and symbolic convergence of two massive, dangerous ambitions. Visualize the tiny, drafty, candlelit chapel inside the great keep of Calais. The warm, flickering yellow light barely fighting off the cold grey shadows of the stone walls. In secrecy, with only trusted retainers, in plate armour standing guard, the king's brother swore his vows to the daughter of the king's greatest enemy. By that act, the line was officially violently crossed. Warwick was no longer just a resentful, sulking subject. He had politically united the power of the mighty Neville family directly to a legitimate, blood-related Prince of York. The warm, golden sun of the Yorkist peace was permanently extinguished by the rising pitch-black cloud of this new and lethal alliance. While the new allies were feasting in Calais, the English countryside was already bleeding. Before he sailed for France, Warwick had meticulously planted the seeds of rebellion across the northern shires. Throughout the spring of 1469, widespread engineered riots and popular uprisings erupted, directed not at the king himself, but at the immense corruption, the heavy, crushing taxation, and the insatiable greed of the Woodville faction. These were not random acts of anger. They were calculated maneuvers. An elusive, phantom leader emerged, calling himself Robin of Redesdale, a name that became a terrifying battle cry for thousands of desperate, armed peasants and disgruntled northern soldiers. The chaos perfectly achieved its strategic goal. King Edward, entirely unaware of the depth of Warwick and Clarence's treachery, reacted in character with aggressive, martial speed. He marched his army north to crush what he mistakenly believed was merely a peasant revolt. In doing so, he fatally isolated himself, separating the king's main force from his two most vital Lancastrian allies, the Earl of Pembroke and the newly elevated Lord Stafford, whose armies were gathering in Wales and the West Country. And then, on a sweltering July day, near the obscure village of Edgecote Moor in Oxfordshire, the meticulously laid trap snapped shut with a horrifying, efficient violence. The Lancastrian forces under Robin of Redesdale, which had been swelling with veteran soldiers wearing Warwick's badge, executed a perfect strategic interception. Try to visualize the deep, suffocating heat of that particular summer day. The dynamic tension as both armies form their lines, the air heavy with dust, the smell of damp wool and the coppery tang of suppressed fear. The peaceful, gentle Palm Sunday of Towton was long gone, replaced by the chaotic fury of a new civil war, in the immediate, horrifying confusion before the main clash. A truly bitter and catastrophic division erupted between the two most vital Yorkist commanders, the newly powerful Lord Stafford, a proud man, engaged in a petty, furious, and deeply human argument with the Earl of Pembroke, supposedly, over a trivial matter of who got to lodge in a particular inn the night before. I find it entirely tragic and entirely human that something so minor could cripple an entire army. In a fit of petty, overwhelming rage, Stafford actually ordered his thousands of men, including vital forces of longbowmen, to break camp and abandon the royal cause on the very eve of the battle. Pembroke, left with a severely depleted force, fought with a desperate, animalistic bravery on Edgecote Moor. He and his Welsh knights, clad in historically accurate, gleaming plate armour, charged again and again, their high-pitched battle cries echoing across the open fields. But bravery cannot overcome numbers and a complete tactical breakdown. The Robin of Redesdale forces, bolstered by new Neville reinforcements, who were said to be singing battle songs as they arrived on the plateau, executed a devastating pincer movement, completely routing the Yorkist army. In the viscous, bloody melee, the Earl of Pembroke, a man who had stood beside King Edward since his terrifying victory at Mortimer's Cross, was captured. He was summarily executed on the very field he had just lost, his blood mixing with the dry, cracked earth of the Oxfordshire summer. In the terrifying, immediate aftermath of the slaughter at Edgecote Moor, the invincible aura surrounding King Edward IV did not just crack. It completely evaporated, leaving him entirely exposed to the wolves. Edward was isolated in the heart of England, his main army shattered and scattered, while his own brother and his greatest subject were marching toward him, not to kneel, but to capture. I find the visual of Edward's final moments of freedom to be profoundly heavy with irony. Visualize the king, still in his magnificent, dust-stained plate armor, standing by his pavilion near Coventry. He is desperately watching the horizon, not for the banners of his enemies, but hoping to see the standard of his ally, the Earl of Pembroke, entirely unaware that Pembroke's severed head was already resting on a Lancastrian pike miles away. Then, on a grey, misty July morning, the quiet of the king's camp was broken, not by the roar of cannons, but by the soft, deliberate approach of an armed force commanded by George Neville, the Archbishop of York and Warwick's Voisny brother. This was not a dynamic, bloody battle. It was a devastating, silent arrest. The Archbishop, wearing his holy vestments over practical chainmail, rode into the royal camp and calmly informed King Edward that for his own safety he must accompany him. Try to visualize the sheer, choking humiliation for this towering warrior king. Edward, the conqueror of Towton and Mortimer's Cross, was forced to disarm, to hand over his greatsword, and was escorted like a common criminal through the winding medieval streets, eventually imprisoned behind the massive, imposing stone walls of Warwick's northern stronghold, Middleham Castle. For the very first time in English history, the realm possessed not one, but two captive kings, both entirely at the mercy of the legendary Kingmaker. Warwick's victory seemed absolute. He immediately moved to purge the government of his enemies. He ordered the brutal, summary executions of Elizabeth Woodville's father, Earl Rivers, and her young brother, John Woodville, their heads spiked on the gates of Coventry as a terrifying warning of Woodville greed's violent end. But Warwick had grossly, fatally underestimated the fundamental nature of medieval power. He believed that holding the king meant holding the kingdom. He was wrong. As soon as the news spread that the anointed king was a prisoner, the very fabric of English society began to violently unravel. Without the king's peace, the law simply ceased to exist. The realm descended instantly into total anarchy. Long-suppressed blood feuds between regional lords erupted into open warfare. Gangs of disbanded soldiers turned into marauding bands of robbers, burning villages and looting merchant caravans with absolute impunity. Warwick, the great general and master politician, discovered that he could only govern through the fear of his own soldiers. He could not command the ancient, deep-seated deference to the royal bloodline. The situation became so catastrophic that the Lancastrian cause, sensing an unprecedented opportunity, suddenly re-emerged from the northern mists. Warwick, unable to raise a significant army of his own, because the English lords stubbornly refused to fight for a jailer, was forced to make a deeply humiliating and desperate strategic climb-down. He had no choice. In October 1469, to suppress the new Lancastrian uprisings, Warwick was forced to release King Edward. Visualize this incredibly tense, unprecedented moment inside the Great Hall of Middleham. The jailer, Warwick, is forced to physically return the heavy royal crown and the great sword of state to his towering prisoner, Edward, and then immediately kneel before him in a public display of fealty that both men knew was an absolute, blinding lie. It was a truce born purely of desperate necessity, and it could not hold. Edward IV, having tasted the terrifying bitterness of captivity, would never trust Warwick again. Warwick, having seen how easily he could lose the kingdom he just conquered, would never be secure until Edward was permanently destroyed. The inevitable final collision happened less than a year later, in early 1470, precipitated by another orchestrated Neville uprising in Lincolnshire. Edward, having learned from his previous military paralysis, marched north with terrifying martial speed, crushing the rebels with relative ease. A dead rebel leader was searched, and found in his jacket was a dynamic, undeniably signed confession written by Warwick and Clarence himself, detailing a complete, coordinated plot to depose Edward and place George, the Duke of Clarence, upon the English throne. There was no longer any room for lies, for Lovedays, or for pretense. Warwick and Clarence, their lethal treachery, officially exposed to the entire kingdom, were declared traitors to their faces. Realizing they could not stand against the king's fresh, victorious army, they were forced into a second, far more humiliating exile. They fled, not to a grand northern fortress, but down to the southwest coast, where they bundled their terrified families, including Clarence's heavily pregnant wife, onto a small fleet of merchant ships. In a truly agonizing twist of fate, as they sailed across the Channel to seek refuge in Warwick's fortress of Calais, the garrison, commanded by a man who had once served Warwick loyally, opened fire on their ships. They were refused entry, forced to continue their perilous voyage across a turbulent, unpredictable sea. They ultimately landed on the sandy shores of the French kingdom at Honfleur, entirely at the mercy of King Louis XI. I find King Louis, infamously known as the Spider King, to be one of the most utterly mesmerizing figures in this entire history. He was a master of political manipulation who didn't fight with swords, but with spies, rumors, and, above all, infinite patience. He saw Warwick and Clarence not as broken refugees, but as incredibly valuable pawns to be used against his mortal enemy, the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who was Edward's closest ally. Louis wove a diplomatic web so audacious, so logic-defying, that it still stuns historians today. He proposed a formal alliance that seemed mathematically impossible, a merger between the North and South Poles. In July 1470, inside the opulent, tapestry-draped chambers of a French royal chateau, a meeting took place that would change the entire course of the war. Visualize this deeply tense scene. On one side stood the powerful, but exiled, Earl of Warwick, the man who had physically captured and imprisoned Henry VI and who had executed Margaret of Anjou's closest friends at St. Albans and Towton. On the other side stood Queen Margaret herself, a woman who possessed a memory for blood feuds longer than any other. She had spent 10 years nursing a white-hot maternal fury against this very man, the destroyer of her life and her son's inheritance. Louis XI, the master manipulator, mediated between them, his eyes gleaming as he pushed them toward the only pragmatic solution. The alliance was finalized. Warwick would use his military genius and vast resources, and Margaret would provide the legitimacy of the Lancastrian name, united for a single, terrifying goal: to depose Edward IV and restore the gentle, pious Henry VI to the massive wooden throne he was never meant to hold. So, this absolute, logic-defying merger between the fierce, exiled Kingmaker and the vengeful Lancastrian Queen, orchestrated in the plush, tapestry-draped chambers of France, set in motion the final, cataclysmic spin of the medieval wheel of fortune. For 10 long years, Queen Margaret had nursed a white-hot maternal fury in her cold exile, her eyes fixed on the heavy English crown that had been violently ripped from her gentle husband's head. And now she was united with the very man who had engineered that destruction. When I reflect on this moment, I am struck by the sheer, staggering pragmatism of survival. The need to destroy King Edward IV was so immense that it consumed decades of hatred, replacing ancient blood feuds with a fragile, razor-sharp alliance born of absolute mutual desperation. Listen to the repetitive, rhythmic creaking of massive wooden ships and the heavy, saturated slap of canvas sails against the misty September wind. In 1470, Warwick, backed by French gold and ships, invaded his own country for the final time. The reaction was breathtakingly swift. King Edward, whose legendary overconfidence had finally, fatally isolated him without an army, woke in the middle of the night to the horrifying sound of his own guards shouting, "A Lancaster! A Lancaster!" in the Coventry shadows. He realized the Kingmaker had already bought his men. Realizing he was hours from capture and certain execution, Edward IV, the towering conqueror of Towton, was forced into a desperate midnight flight. Visualize the king, accompanied only by his brilliant younger brother, Richard of Gloucester, and a handful of desperate knights, riding their fastest horses in the freezing darkness to the Norfolk coast, stealing a tiny ship and fleeing across the freezing, turbulent sea to the relative safety of the Burgundian court. Behind him, the Yorkist dawn completely extinguished. For 6 surreal months, England witnessed a resurrection that still stuns historians today, a period known as the Re-adeption of Henry VI. The powerful Earl of Warwick rode triumphantly into the City of London and went directly to the Tower, not to inspect the defences, but to unlock the cell of the pious, mentally fragile Lancastrian king. Try to visualize that truly bizarre scene inside the cold, damp stone chamber. They found Henry VI sitting in the dust, perhaps praying, his mind long broken, his body neglected, wearing robes that were little more than rags. The Kingmaker, the man who had physically captured him 5 years earlier, now knelt before him, begging his forgiveness, bathing his feet and ensuring he was washed, dressed in magnificent royal velvets, and placed back upon the massive wooden throne of Westminster, while a confused, terrified crowd looked on. But the re-adeption was a hollow farce. Henry VI was only a royal ghost, a passive, empty symbol moved silently around the board by Warwick. Behind the throne, the real power was crumbling rapidly. The English nobles, including the unstable Duke of Clarence, who was Warwick's other son-in-law, grew intensely restless. Clarence realized that as the second son of York, a restored Lancastrian dynasty would leave him absolutely nowhere. And he began to secretly, desperately look back toward his exiled brother across the sea. The inevitable counter-coup happened with dynamic, terrifying speed. In March of 1471, King Edward IV, backed by Burgundian money and ships, landed back on the rugged Yorkshire coast with a fresh, tiny army. And here I find Edward's sheer, desperate cunning entirely fascinating. He didn't initially claim the throne. He meticulously copied the lies of Henry Bolingbroke, generations earlier, publicly wearing only the simple ostrich feather badge of the Prince of Wales, swearing solemn, sacred oaths to the terrified townsfolk that he had only returned to reclaim his rightful family dukedom of York. He only wanted his lands back, he cried. It was a beautiful, devastating lie. As he marched south, the Yorkist lords, hungry for return and tired of the fragile Lancastrian peace, flocked to his standard, their ancient loyalties to the sun in splendor ignited once more. When the massive Yorkist army approached London, the final, fatal turn occurred within Edward's own family. George, the unstable Duke of Clarence, seeing his magnificent, victorious older brother, realized his betrayal of Warwick was essential for his own survival. Clarence publicly deserted Warwick's Lancastrian alliance and rode across the open field, dropping to his knees before King Edward and begging his forgiveness. The Yorkist brothers were reunited, and the Kingmaker's fate was sealed. The resulting Battle of Barnet, fought on a freezing Easter Sunday morning in 1471, was a fittingly Gothic and tragic end to the Kingmaker's legend. Close your eyes and visualize that horrific, terrifying battlefield. It was fought not in the clear, sharp light of day, but in a thick, blinding, and claustrophobic white fog that blanketed the Oxfordshire landscape. You could not see your own comrades 10 feet away. In the confusing mist, the Lancastrian lines actually attacked themselves. In a devastating strategic error, their longbowmen, mistaking the star badge of a noble ally for the sun badge of the Yorkist king. The resulting panic and the dynamic, relentless Yorkist charge completely shattered the Lancastrian army. The Earl of Warwick, the legendary maker and unmaker of kings, realizing the battle was lost, was pulled down from his horse in the bloody mud. He was stripped of his armor and brutally, summarily killed, his body left naked and exposed to the cold, wet wind, a final, visceral warning of overweening ambition. But the tragedy of the Red Rose was not quite finished. On the very day Warwick died at Barnet, Queen Margaret of Anjou finally landed on the southwest coast with her son, Prince Edward, and a fresh army. She received the devastating news of her ally's death, but with a fierce maternal stubbornness, she resolved to fight on. Her forces raced north, desperately attempting to cross the River Severn into Wales, to unite with loyal Lancastrian lords. Edward, displaying his signature martial energy, intercepted her at the town of Tewkesbury. The ensuing Battle of Tewkesbury, fought in May 1471, was the total, absolute annihilation of the Lancastrian cause. The fierce, powerful Yorkist army crushed the tired Red Rose forces. And here our long story touches its most tragic point. In the visceral, chaotic melee, Margaret's only beloved child, the 18-year-old Prince Edward, the last Lancastrian hope, was killed. He did not die on a scaffold, but cut down in a muddy field, the white rose finally drinking the very essence of the red rose. Queen Margaret was captured, her spirit finally, completely, utterly broken, carried back to London as a wretched, broken prisoner of the very king she had sought to destroy. That same night, as the victorious King Edward entered the city, the gentle, pious Henry VI, who had been put back into the Tower, was quietly, efficiently murdered. The official report said, "He died of melancholy, but the entire kingdom knew that the Red Rose had been permanently rooted out." With the king, the prince, and the Kingmaker dead, the House of Lancaster was seemingly extinguished forever, and the deep, rich son of York shone entirely unopposed. The peaceful second reign of Edward IV lasted for 12 prosperous years, a visual feast of medieval stability, broken only by the inevitable final clash within his own family. The jealousy and ambition of the Duke of Clarence finally became too much for the king to bear. In 1478, in a terrifying display of royal ruthlessness, Edward had his own brother George privately executed in the Tower, supposedly and most memorably by being drowned in a massive barrel of sweet Malmsey wine. It is an image that persists, a final, bizarre note of dynastic cruelty, but the peaceful Yorkist reign was merely a brief sunset. When the charismatic King Edward IV died in 1483, leaving only a young, unprotected son, the realm descended instantly back into the familiar cold darkness of dynastic chaos. Edward's own younger brother, the brilliant but deeply ambitious Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the opportunity. In a swift, dynamic, and controversial coup, he declared his nephews illegitimate, seized the throne for himself as King Richard III, and the young princes famously and tragically vanished into the dark shadows of the Tower of London forever. I find it deeply fascinating that the final, resolving chord of this epic story was struck not by the ancient great families, but by an unlikely, dark horse candidate waiting in the long shadows of French exile. His name was Henry Tudor. He possessed only a threadbare, legally restricted Lancastrian claim through his mother, but he was the very last hope for the shattered Red Rose faction. On a hot, dusty August day in 1485, near the town of Bosworth in the English Midlands, the definitive final battle was fought. Visualize that historical field, the long grass dry and crackling, King Richard III, wearing his crown and fighting with a ferocious, desperate bravery, realized his own trusted nobles were deserting him. He launched a single, dynamic, animalistic cavalry charged directly at Henry Tudor, coming within a few feet of striking down the Lancastrian hope, before he was surrounded, isolated, and brutally hacked to death, his blood mixing with the dust. It was the absolute end of the medieval warrior kings. In a stunning, highly theatrical gesture, Richard's crown, having rolled from his head into a nearby hawthorn bush, was found by a soldier, dusted off, and placed upon the head of Henry Tudor. The Wars of the Roses were, visually and physically, over. The long, violent night was finally breaking. When Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, was formally crowned, he understood that to permanently heal the fractured, bleeding kingdom, he needed to unite the symbols that had defined a generation of slaughter. He moved with immense political sensitivity. He took for his queen, Elizabeth of York, the beautiful eldest daughter of Edward IV, the very symbol of the white rose. Close your eyes one last time and visualize that magnificent, truly historic wedding inside the ancient stone vaults of Westminster. It is the visual of a permanent, sacred truce. The young, new king and his stunning Yorkist queen stand hand in hand before the high altar, illuminated by the warm, dancing golden light of hundreds of dynamic candles. It is the end of the blood feuds, the end of the betrayals, and the end of the Roses' War. From this day forward, the deep velvet red rose and the pure white rose would no longer be plucked separately as badges of war. Instead, they were permanently, beautifully woven together by a single, powerful, and defining act of love and political synthesis, forming a single, stunning new emblem that would define a century, the red and white Tudor rose. Let this final image of unity, peace, and ancient rivalries reconciled drift with you now, and allow yourself to sink deeper into a quiet, profound, and peaceful rest.